Hi, I'm Stephen Carson, welcoming you to Radical Liberation and coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. Um, Shilling is brief. Subscribe star is how I get my support, and thanks to a couple supporters who added on. I wanted to say that on air because at least a couple of them are just like user random number or something. They're anonymous. So wanted to don't know who they are, but sent them a note on Subscribestar and wanted to thank them publicly for the support of the show. So great. I also wanted to mention, I don't mention it every week and I should, but it brought my attention. We have a Discord, which is sort of the front door for our community around the show. And we have an alt tech platform, which if you go to the Discord, you can find your way to. Big advantage of the alt tech platform is they won't kick us off, whereas Discord probably will, because they've been pretty hostile to people like us. So please join the Discord community and then figure out how to make your way to the alt tech. The folks there will help you. It caught my attention because on Discord, it just broke 800 users there. So we've got a really good community there. So want you to join that. All right, let's bring Ryan on and let me rectify a terrible mistake I made last week. Welcome, Ryan.
Hello, how are you?
1 week ago, on the very day we were doing the show, you had a birthday, right?
Yeah, May the 12th,
And if no, wait,
2022.
May the
It
12th.
would have
No,
been,
that 2 weeks ago.
yes, 2 weeks ago. So,
Oh, wait, I
um,
thought it was last week you brought up your birthday. Anyway, I missed your birthday. And it was on a show day too, so I should have covered it. What tender age did you turn on May the 12th, 2022, Ryan, if I may ask?
I I am 19 years old now. No longer just 18. So, one year away from turning 20, I can finally enter. You know, people might actually start recognizing me as an adult instead of that crazy young kid from Oklahoma.
Right. So Ryan, in case you guys didn't know, is literally a teenager. We're not making that up. He's literally a teenager, and we're gonna milk that for 1 more year, and then we'll leave aside all that sort of talk about him being young. Um, okay. Well, happy birthday, Ryan. I'm sorry I didn't acknowledge it closer to your birthday.
It's fine.
Okay.
It's fine.
So um, let's get right into it. Ryan's got a little bit of a limited time today. Um, but we have something where, in both cases, I think the authors are trying to gently bring us to a place that feels quite radical. But for this audience of this show, I don't think this is going to be quite as hard to swallow for everybody. So I do think these articles are really important. I do want to walk you through them, but I don't think we need to beat it to death. So I think we'll be able to wrap this up in about an hour, which is about how much time we have with Ryan today. Um, okay, so let's get right to it. Oh, I don't know if I'm even on the right article, am I? Let's see. Nope. Let me switch to our first thing we wanted to highlight, which is by Thomas 777, and it's gone. Okay,
Oh
give
no.
me a sec. Control streaming. Okay, give me a sec. What is the deal with this? Sorry, had the article all queued up and now it's not there. What's the deal? 2, 3. Okay, sorry. Talk about Thomas 777's article. Oh, I got it. There it is. Okay. Gottfried,
So,
oh, that could be bigger. Let me see if I can
for
just,
the audience, both
yeah,
of these articles, almost by happy coincidence, fit very nicely together. They're both talking about the exact same thing, but they do reach slightly different conclusions. So we will be starting off with Thomas's article and going over the groundwork. He has some
right.
very good observations there. And we will be going into an article that you can find on Skeptical Waves channel in
Yes,
audio format, which should be in the description of this video.
that's
Um,
right. Yeah,
if
so
you
I'm
want to hear
point
the full
this article you're looking at is linked to by Thomas 777 is linked to in the video description, and then we link to the audio version by Skeptical Waves of the main article that we're going to cover. Um, this both has to do with the law and the changing nature of the law um, recently, which perhaps some people have noticed. And I particularly like here that Thomas builds off the work of Paul Gottfried. and his work on the therapeutic state. And in turn, we could look back to C.S. Lewis, who also wrote about the therapeutic state and abolition of man and places like that. And then Thomas Saz was huge on the therapeutic state, of course, with his opposition to coercive use of medicine. The state and medicine being tied up together, and sort of like he liked to talk about it. For example, the Soviet Union putting pastors in jail because they were declared mentally having a mental illness because they believed in God, and from the point of view of the atheist Soviet regime, that meant you were mentally ill, right? So you must need to be confined or something. So anyway, that sort of thing is something Thomas Saz was very good on. So this article is called Gottfried, Long COVID and the Therapeutic State. What he says is that COVID has laid waste the notions of democracy, constitutionalism, and popular sovereignty, and utterly vindicated elitist and absolutist conceptions of politics. And what does that mean? It means social change is top-down, sovereignty is unitary and indivisible. All our political concepts are thinly veiled theological concepts. And here he's referring to stuff that you might be hearing from Academic Agent, if you've been listening to him recently, and his new book, Populist Delusion. All of these things are covered in that book, for example. And by the way, I feel like AA should make more of a point of mentioning that the Populist Delusion is a short book. And it's a little book. It's, what is it?
Really?
It's about 100. Yeah, it's about 150 pages. Let me see if I can kind of hold it up here. That's the thinness of the book. Okay. It's just a little handheld thing. It's almost like manifesto size or something, Anyway, it's not a long book. It's 150 pages. And of course, as we know, AA is a great communicator, great writer. He really is. I've edited one of his books, and he's an excellent writer. So if these ideas are new to you, like, what do you mean social change is top down and sovereignty is unitary and theological concepts are really, the theology and politics are really tied up together, then read the Populist Delusion. So, okay. So he talks about the idea of long COVID, and long COVID is the consequences of COVID, not the disease, right? But the social, political consequences of COVID, which is massive structural change, or what we might call, and hopefully I'm getting this right. This is the Schmidt reference here, a permanent state of exception, right? That notion of exception is Schmidt, right?
Yes. Specifically, the exception proves the rule. So you find the notion of exceptions quite a lot in Schmidt. Both the very fact that the exception exists, if I understand correctly, and I'm not the foremost Schmidt scholar, but the fact that the exception exists, number one, means there must be a rule for there to be an exception, and the extent to which there is an exception and to how much leeway it is afforded also shows how strong the rule is and whether it actually holds up. And then, of course, in typical Schmittian fashion, whoever is the exception and whoever is allowed to be the exception will be decided by the people actually wielding power. So you get sort of a friend-enemy way into there.
Okay, so this is the line I actually quoted when I shared Thomas's article. Even the man in the street now understands that laws basically mean nothing and can be bent into whatever shape will produce desired outcomes. We saw this with the COVID being declared, and hey, we can't have large gatherings. But then there were BLM demonstrations, and they said, well, this is a matter of public health because racism is a public health crisis. And a lot of people were like, words and rules just don't mean anything anymore, right? So I think that's what Thomas is getting at here. And he points out that the radical right has known this for a long time. Laws and constitutions are just pieces of paper. They can't overrule men because pieces of paper don't have will, and men do. But he says here, even so, the law may only be a speed bump. It still is a speed bump, and legal formalities have had to be overcome. And they have been overcome by a mechanism that Paul Gottfried described. And that's by expanding the definition of harm. And here it's interesting. He goes after classical liberalism, the notion of the harm principle. Uh, and he points to John Stuart Mill, which is scary, of course, because John Stuart Mill was, of course, a traitor to classical liberalism, in my view. And Hayek wrote much more learnedly on John Stuart Mill and how he was the real turn from classical
Right.
liberalism to social democracy, basically.
You can
So
summarize it by he injected rather utilitarianism into the whole school. So
right,
in that sense, he brings out more socialistic elements.
right, yeah, and we end up in some very bad places. Not just later, but John Stuart Mill himself goes to some very bad places, and really turns classical liberalism into its opposite, I would say, modern liberalism or the social democracy. But anyway, never mind all that. The point is that the principle of harm smuggles into our lives what Gottfried calls the therapeutic state. And that means that the purpose of the state is, oh, well, I'll just quote Thomas. He says it better. So, drawing on the work of Christopher Lasch, the basic idea of Gottfried's therapeutic state is that the state's legitimate duty of care, it's their job to take care of us, right? To keep us safe, to keep us healthy, can be beaten into any shape that will serve the cause of progressive social engineering. And of course, that's what we've seen. I'm going to skip a bit here.
Right. Yeah, public welfare just turns into whatever agenda we need to push through.
I'll just quote this because I like this passage. So under this regime of the therapeutic state, you are not just prejudiced, you are a xenophobe, a homophobe, a transphobe. These are medical terms, right? Like psychological terms. Like you have a phobia, you have a mental illness, right? You are not just sexist, you are sexually dysfunctional. You are not just a fascist, you have the authoritarian personality type and must undergo social therapy designed by Theodor Adorno. So this goes way back, right? Because here, the authoritarian personality type, the F type or whatever, Theodor Adorno, this is right after World War II, pretty much, 40s, 50s, something like that. But we're really seeing it fully flower, I think, is the point here in the last 10 or 20 years. And then with COVID, it's just out in the open. So the obsession with safety and well-being becomes the way in which they push through a new understanding of our laws and so forth. Okay, so anyway, the point of all this is that with COVID, it has become clear that the law means what they say it means, and they can do what they want to do with it. And that's a frightening thought. So let's just skip right over. Again, that article is pointed to in the video description. So let me recommend that to you. It's not long, as you saw. Let's skip right over now to an article that addresses this same point, I think. Where am I? Sorry, juggling windows. Okay, there it is. Yeah, okay, so an article that addresses this same point about the law and its malleability and its political nature. But John Hanses wrote this, a legal scholar wrote this in 1995. So we're going on, what is that? Almost heading towards 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And here he's attacking the notion of the rule of law, which is the idea that we will have a legal system that will be sort of neutral, and we can uphold that neutral legal system. And when you're upholding that neutral legal system, you're not doing anything political. You're not being partisan, for example. It's not partisan, and you can see the plausibility. It's not partisan to prosecute someone for murder or theft, right?
Right.
That's just keeping a society going, right? Well, as he's going to show us, it's not that simple.
Yeah, the idea is that if you just enforce what's written down and what everyone clearly agrees on, then it transcends division or partisan activity.
Okay, so like I said, in both these articles, but especially in Hanses' article, we're going to see that there's a lot of softening up, trying to ease people into this recognition. And I don't think our audience needs quite so much hand-holding, but we'll just go through some of this and skip over other bits. First of all, he introduces, he talks about Orwell's notion of doublethink, because he's going to show us how we have had a sense of a doublethink about the legal system. He says not only is it possible for people to believe both halves of a contradiction, it is something they do every day with no apparent difficulty, and consider people's beliefs about the legal system. So on the one hand, we have the common complaint that members of Congress are corrupt. They're legislating for their own political benefit or for that of special interest groups. And so this shows us, and everybody, this is not like crazy stuff to say this, right? You'll hear this from the left, you'll hear this from the right, you'll hear this from the center. Like people recognize this.
It would be even more insane to go out to anyone and say Congress is not corrupt. Like
right,
that
exactly, yeah. Right. So we all see this, right? So we understand that the laws under which we live are a product of political forces rather than the embodiment of the ideal of justice. So we should be done right there, right? Because that is kind of the point of the article, is that there is no rule of law in the sense of sort of this neutral law. It's just politics. It's just, interest groups and certain people pushing their ideas of how things should be. But as he points out, understanding this, which this is very common understanding. This is not like edgelord stuff to say this, right? This is very common understanding. At the same time, this doesn't prevent people from regarding the law as a body of definite, politically neutral rules, amenable to an impartial application, which all citizens have a moral obligation to obey. So I think just to pick on conservatives for a moment, conservatives would be a great example. Your boomer con, right? Totally complaining about the corruption of Congress and throw the bums out. What was Trump's thing? Drain the swamp, right?
Drain the swamp, yeah.
Drain the swamp, yeah. You're totally going to hear this from your boomer conservative, while at the same time saying, hey, I'm all about law and order, and you've got to be a law-abiding citizen, and the majesty of the law, right? Okay, well, wait. Which is it? Okay, is the law a product of corruption in Congress, or is it a majestic thing that you have to obey to show that you're a good boy? Right.
And the thinking for the average person on this is that most laws were not legislated in their lifetime, unless perhaps you live in post-Blairite United Kingdom jurisdiction.
Right.
But for people in the US, when you're usually talking about a controversial law, very rarely is it just put into place. Sometimes it's a generation to like 4 or 5 generations removed. And you can go back into history and see the segregation, slavery, at the time of which there was great, or the hottest point of contention for all those issues. It wasn't legislated by the generation that was opposing them. It had already happened long before they were born. So there's a sort of idea among normal people that because the laws are old, if they agree with the law, then it needs to be respected and it's obviously correct. We all agree on it. Or if they don't agree with it, then somehow, you magically flip to the other side. Well, it was made by corrupt and evil people. This can be the same person. The same person can acknowledge both of these at the same time about different laws and somehow does not see the contradiction underlying them.
Right. Okay. So, let's see. So he says, when the Supreme Court hands down a controversial ruling on a subject such as abortion, civil rights, or capital punishment, then like Louis in Casablanca, the public is shocked to find that the court may have let political considerations influence its decision. And I forget, someone just said this recently, that once the Supreme Court, the myth of the Supreme Court is broken, they said then it's over. That's sort of the last thing that everybody's like, okay, well, yeah, but the majesty of the Supreme Court, right? You'll hear complaints, but ultimately people will feel like, well, if the Supreme Court makes that decision, I don't like it, and we're going to fight to change it, but we've got to respect it. Well, once that ends, because they pack the Supreme Court or whatever, or just, people are like, just see how nakedly political it is. Once that ends, you might say that the post, Madison versus Marbury? The Madison versus Marbury constitutional arrangement we've had is over. Once people go, Supreme Court can say whatever it wants. Like the famous Andrew Jackson quote, right, Ryan? How many? What is it? How many
Let
troops
the
does
court
the
enforce its own rules.
say it again?
How many troops is Stalin talking about the Pope? I believe Andrew Jackson said, "Let the court enforce its own laws."
Yeah, let the court enforce its own laws. Sorry, right. Yeah, so once we get to that point where everybody's like, yeah, I heard the Supreme Court decided that, I don't care,
Right.
then our current system's kind of over, right? But for now,
Right.
there's still a little bit of like, mystique and majesty around the court. I don't think it's gone quite yet.
It's certainly fading, and
It's
you can see
fading.
that because every single nomination is just a political battle. However, there is still a sizable amount of people, maybe due to their high school civics indoctrination or something like that, that believe that, well, after we have this extremely partisan battle over who gets appointed, then it becomes nonpartisan and it's just going to do its own thing.
Right.
Judicial review,
Magically.
the idea, yeah, the idea that the Supreme Court can just amend laws based off of interpretation. So, judicial review, for those that aren't familiar with United States history, was not originally within the powers of the Supreme Court. That was an innovation after the founding of the Constitution. So, this relies on people to believe that the Supreme Court is nonpartisan. Not in actuality, because of course it's not going to be above politics, but it relies on people to believe that it is, because that is the only way that their interpretation will be taken seriously. It has no enforcement mechanism necessarily.
Okay, so let's see. Oh, yeah. Well, I thought this was persuasive, actually, this next line. He says, when you hear this condemnation of the judiciary for undemocratic judicial activism or unprincipled social engineering, or I don't know why I didn't throw this phrase in, legislating from the bench, right?
Yeah,
That's a big one, Ryan. They're
yeah.
legislating from the bench. Maybe that's more of a conservative critique to say that. I don't know. Um, well, until the court does something they don't like, and then then the left will be talking about how striking down Roe versus Wade was legislating from the bench, right? You can
Yeah.
just you can place money on that if you like and have some free money. Anyway,
These retorts aren't just to one side. It's for the same person that holds these contradictory beliefs.
right.
It's well to emphasize that.
Right. So, they're legislating from the bench. He says, when you hear that, that's a reflection of the public's belief that the law consists of a set of definite and consistent neutral principles, which the judge is obligated to apply in an objective manner, free from the influence of his or her personal, political, and moral beliefs. So we see that as sort of an ideal, justice is blind, and all that. But do we believe that that's how things really work? So Husna says, I believe, much as Orwell suggested, it is the public's ability to engage in this type of doublethink, to be aware that the law is inherently political in character, and yet, at the same time, to believe it to be an objective embodiment of justice, that accounts for the amazing degree to which the federal government is able to exert its control over supposedly free people. So he thinks this goes right to the root of the creeping power of the state in modern times, because you still have the people who should be resisting this, in essence, are going along with it because, hey, it's the law and order. What do you want? Chaos in society? You know?
And that's the only way that presidents like FDR could confiscate gold, for instance. The
Mm-hmm.
only way that could happen in any feasible manner is if people let it happen. You could have had mass resistance if there's just complete lack of confidence in FDR or the executive branch or the government itself. It would not have happened. People would have kept their gold. But the fact that people
Yeah.
trusted it, that is the only way that these tyrannical measures can actually be implemented in full force.
Right. So he talks about the myth of the rule of law. That's the name of the article, name of the episode, the myth of the rule of law. Because what his concern is here is not the rule of law, because he doesn't believe in it, right? As he's going to explain. His concern is the power of the myth of the rule of law. So that's really what's important here, is our belief in the rule of law. The rule of law, as a myth, suggests an absence of arbitrariness, an absence of the worst abuses of tyranny, The image presented by the slogan, America is a government of laws and not people, is one of fair and impartial rule rather than subjugation to human whim. But going back to the BLM riots, right? We saw over the last couple of years, we saw anarcho-tyranny, where some people, enemies of the regime, get controlled and bossed around. Other people literally are rioting in the streets and then being let out of the jail cell the next day.
Right. Yes.
Right.
And that's been a tactic since the civil rights era. If the regime-approved rioters and protesters get locked up, mysteriously there's about 4 or 5 foundations waiting to pay bail and basically get every single record of those rioters and protesters scrubbed off the books.
Right.
It's just how we operate post 1960, for better or worse. It's something to deal with for us, and it's great for the regime.
Okay, so here's his points that he's going to make in the article. 3 points. 1, there is no such thing as a government of law and not people. Very similar to what Thomas said, right? He said that, constitutions don't have will, people have will. 2, the belief that there is serves to maintain public support for society's power structure. And 3, the establishment of a truly free society requires the abandonment of the myth of the rule of law. Okay, now, this is one of those sections that I plan to basically mostly skip in this article. This article was actually written for a law review, a legal journal, a law review type article, journal. Right. So he goes into law cases and so forth. I'm going to give you just a little taste of this. If you're interested, listen to Skeptical Waves or pull up the PDF of this, which is freely available. If you're interested in the legal side, but we are not a legal podcast, so I'm not going to try to compete with those great ones that are done by lawyers like Robert Barnes and so forth. Okay, so he gives a hypothetical about suing a doctor who wasn't available, and one person believes that doctors are human beings, they're entitled to take a day off, and he finds a case, Hurley versus Eddingfield, which establishes the rule that in the absence of an explicit contract, that is, when there's been no actual meeting of the minds, there can be no liability, and therefore, since the doctor didn't even know this person was sick, it's not his fault, and so it's okay. Then the other person, though, feels that there's a special obligation to care for the sick. It'd be wrong and set a terrible example for doctors to ignore the needs of regular patients who depend on them. So she finds Cottenham versus Wisdom. These are all actual cases, of course, footnoted in the article. She finds Cottenham versus Wisdom, which establishes the rule that in the absence of an explicit contract, the law will imply a contractual relationship where such is necessary to avoid injustice. So they come to class and they each say, here's the way to decide this case. We each have our precedent to cite, and they give the exact opposite resolution of the case. Each is expecting the professor to confirm their analysis and dismiss the other ones as a misguided bit of illogic. But when they say, Professor, who is right? He says, you got to learn to think like a lawyer, and then you'll be able to answer that question for yourself. Well, I'll cut to the chase. Thinking like a lawyer means that you realize that you can kind of bend the law. You can find something in the law to justify about anything.
Yeah, you can bend the law, or the law is just plain contradictory and you make it work to your favor.
And you find the bits that help you and you ignore the bits that don't, or whatever, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so unlike the laws of nature, political laws are not consistent. Okay. There's, different cases decided with different contexts by different judges. There's legislation, of course, I think has made it really chaotic. And that distinction between law and legislation is an interesting one that we won't get into here. But legislation makes it even worse, right? Because, no one does a consistency check for what the legislature does. Wait. You can't pass this law. It doesn't fit with the law you just passed last week. Like, there literally is no one who does that. Right.
Or sometimes you might get people of differing political persuasions to say, but that's hypocritical. You just did this the other day, and now you're doing this today against a different group of people. it's inconsistent and hypocritical. So,
And
you know,
no one cares.
yeah, you do get that, but it's just shouting into the wind, and we can see why later on in this article.
Right. Right. Um, okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, I didn't highlight this, but real quick. So, um, he says, so when human beings engage in legal reasoning, they imagine it's like sort of scientific or empirical reasoning. You make a sound argument, and you naturally conclude that if your hypothesis is correct, then the competing hypotheses are therefore incorrect, right? And so, in terms of legal reasoning, you say, hey, I've shown, I found this precedent here clearly. This is the right way to decide this case, and other people are wrong. And he says this is a fallacy because the legal world is comprised of contradictory rules, and there will be sound legal arguments available, not only for the hypothesis that you're trying to push, but for other competing hypotheses as well. Like everybody can come up with a good case for their case, right?
Right.
That's what he's saying. Okay, so now he does another one, which I'm going to skip, on discrimination law. But it's the same idea. He's just driving home the point that you can find case law to support, but precedent, case law to cite to support completely contradictory outcomes. So, what does that mean? It means that legal conclusions are always determined by the normative assumptions of the decision maker. The law is never neutral and objective. That is, with all these competing and contradictory rules, you go with, as he says, the thing that intuitively feels right, meaning that the decision that is congruent, or the reasoning that's congruent with your antecedent underlying political and moral beliefs. So what we imagine sometimes it's imagined or sometimes it's even claimed, that we can sort of set aside our metaphysics, our assumptions, and we can just have this sort of neutral set of rules and just apply the neutral set of rules, and that'll be fair, and everybody will understand what the rules are. And he says, but that doesn't work in real life. In real life, you do bring your assumptions and your metaphysics to everything. And because the rules are not simple and straightforward, and it's even worse, as he's going to show in a moment, than that, then really your assumptions, your deep assumptions, even if you don't consciously realize them, end up determining the path you take through the legal reasoning, for example.
Right, and there's a good corollary to this principle, once again with Carl Schmitt, where he has the famous quote, "The sovereign is he who decides the exception." That is, the sovereign is he who sets the normative stance on the law or applying it or on any decision, and then can decide what is the exception. So, on the one hand, you have laws must be applied and decided on by one person or a group of people, by people that decide what is normal and what is not. And then also, the people or person that decides what is normal or what is not is also the sovereign. So we have those two principles that go together quite nicely.
Right. Okay. Let's see. Oh, this is another case, right? Yeah. Okay. Another one of his examples of these two lawyers. Yeah, the law is always open to interpretation. There's no such thing as a normatively neutral interpretation. The way one interprets the rules of law is always determined by one's underlying moral and political beliefs. Okay, so he argues with all this that law is inherently political. Academic Agent has talked about liberalism as the attempt to eliminate the political from life, right? And he said that's not going to work. You're not going to get rid of the political because as Aristotle said, we're a political animal, right? I think he said that. Right. Anyway, so he says, okay, but let's say you're like, yes, okay, you've convinced me. That is how things have been, and yes, they really are being political, and even in the Supreme Court and so forth, and of course, as everyone recognizes, in the legislature, in the Senate and the House, for example, in the United States. But maybe you don't believe the law must be this way, that it can never be definite and politically neutral. So he's going to make his steelman his case even more here, right? So you believe the
Right.
law can be reformed, and to bring about an end to political strife, institute a true rule of law, we merely need to create a legal system comprised of consistent rules expressed in clear, definite language. And Hasna says, can't be done. We can't. We even with all the goodwill in the world, we could not produce such a legal code because there is simply no such thing as uninterpretable language, right?
Right.
Um, all things need to be interpreted, and you can think in the United States, you can think about all the arguments over what is it called? Original intent? Is that the
Right.
term of art?
I mean, yeah, that gets tossed around a lot, so it definitely works for what you're trying to describe. Basically, people trying to discern what did the writers of this law or the Constitution, or even going back to the Declaration, what did they mean by this?
Right.
Well, supposedly there's a consensus on by more conservative-minded people that we know exactly what they meant by it, but even that's a stretch for reasons that this paragraph is about to go right into.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Right. So you mean like the Commerce Clause?
Yes, exactly. That is
Um,
my favorite example, and I saw someone joke about that the other day, where they said the next constitution is just going to be the Commerce Clause because you can derive everything from
yeah. Right. Why have everything else there? Um, so relatively straightforward language of the Commerce Clause, which gave Congress the power to regulate commerce among the several states. And this has been interpreted to permit the regulation of both farmers growing wheat for use on their own farms and the nature of male female relationships in all private businesses that employ more than 15 persons. So, no matter how
it. Right.
clear. Now, that the funny thing here, Ryan, is, in terms of the project of creating a legal system comprised of consistent rules expressed in clear, definite language, honestly, I have to say the Constitution is not terrible, not a terrible attempt. I mean, it's
Right,
short.
and
It's short. It's actually quite clear. It says things like Congress shall make no law, right?
right.
Like,
Well,
what's hard to understand about that? And yet,
this is the issue, because a lot of those, a lot of the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and even the Declaration, if you want to go back to foundational, the foundation for the Constitution and other laws that came right after it, do seem to be written very clearly, um, which is very damning to anyone that says that, well, we can just write something uninterpretable, because this was meant to be it, and it obviously is not. And any common person, if you just showed them the text without saying where it was from and assuming they couldn't recognize it, would probably come to the same conclusion. Congress shall make no law regarding X or banning X. Well, that probably means that Congress, the legislative body, just cannot legislate on that topic. However, that's not the conclusion that our lawmakers have reached, and even some conservatives. So it is interpretable. Um, and furthermore, and I don't think that he went into this specifically, language can evolve over time, and you
yes,
can lose meaning as language evolves. So the uninterpretable ideal would have to be in a language that just does not change or evolve.
right.
Which is impossible.
Which is not human language because human language grows and
Right,
changes.
exactly.
Right.
Right.
Okay. Well, let's keep going. Okay. Yeah, and he drives home the point again. Look at the article if you feel like you need more persuasion. He actually starts with a test about, how seriously do you take the language of the First Amendment? Um, and I kind of skipped that, but I did like this one line. I chose this portion of the First Amendment because it contains the clearest, most definite legal language of which I am aware. Right? Congress shall pass no law. Right? Like, where's the wiggle room there? And yet, um, okay. So he says, let's say that I've failed to convince you of the impossibility of reforming the law into a body of definite, consistent rules that produces determinate results. The computer programmers are going crazy, right? They're going, no, we can program it, right? We can use like computer language, which is
Yeah.
precise and interpreted by the machine, and we can make something that is completely like rigid. Okay. And he says, even if you could do that, it shouldn't be. It should not be rigid in that way. And why is that? Because one of the purposes of law is to ensure a stable social environment to provide order. And that's where you would put this emphasis on, let's have like law that's like a program, like an algorithm, and really rigid and static and predictable. If this happens, if this person does this to this person, the law is going to come down on the case like this every time. It's a program. The robot will be our judge, right? The algo will be our judge. But that's not good enough, because not just any order will work. Another purpose of the law must be to do justice. So the goal of the law is to provide a social environment which is both orderly and just.
Right. The Christian might say that the law should promote virtue and punish vice.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you have that you could look at it from as well if you need a clarification.
And he says the problem is order and justice are in tension, because the more definite and rigidly determined the rules of law become, the less the legal system is able to do justice to the individual. So even if we could reform the law to make it wholly definite and consistent, we should not. Okay, and so he gives, and did I not highlight this example? Oh yeah, it was a case where, yeah, I'll go through it real quick. So, one of the important things in that libertarians, for example, put big emphasis on is that you must enforce contract, and fraud should be illegal, right? Fraud is essentially just another way of stealing from people, and obviously theft and murder should be illegal, but fraud should be as well, which is basically to trick people out of their stuff as opposed to just hitting them over the head and taking it. There's more than one way to steal, right? So fraud is essentially a corollary of outright physical theft. So he gives this case of Agnes Siester, a lonely and elderly widow who fell for the blandishments and flattery of those who ran an Arthur Murray dance studio in Des Moines, Iowa. They used some highly innovative sales techniques to sell this 68-year-old woman 4,057 hours of dance instruction, including 3 life memberships and a course in Gold Star dancing, which was the type of dancing done by Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, only about twice as difficult, for a total cost of $33,497 in 1960 dollars. Right? So I didn't do the inflation adjustment, but it's a lot of money to get out of an old woman. Here's the problem. She voluntarily agreed to purchase that. Like, it was a contract that she voluntarily agreed to. And yet, everybody's looking at it and going, this is wrong. It's unjust. They've tricked this woman into handing them a ton of money, right? And he says this is precisely the sort of solution, to allow her to recover that money. It's precisely the sort of solution that our reformed, determinate, robot, algorithm contract law is designed to outlaw. Since she voluntarily contracted for the dance lessons, she's liable to pay the full amount for them. And that's tough, right? But it would go against our sense of justice. And if your legal system goes against the sense of justice, eventually people just ignore it. Okay, and then he gives a different example, but you get the idea. You've got to balance, or here he says it, the greater the degree of certainty we build into the law, the less able the law becomes to do justice, because justice has to do with dealing with the individual case to some degree. Right. Okay, so
look at the comments. Look at the example that he gave, where you have the woman being tricked out of something where it's on paper, it looks perfectly legal.
Right.
With that, you can have an infinite number of cases with slight variations that will just completely fly under any very strict and certain justice system. So in that sense, you sort of have, if I remember correctly, the Roman standard where every case is judged on a case-by-case basis, which is one end of an extreme. But it's how you allow for a maximum amount of justice, because all of those cases will vary. No one case is exactly like the other in that regard. There's always going to be some different detail, where if you did have that programmed algorithm, that determines what is and is not legal, it will miss it just because, all these things, as long as they satisfy these conditions, it's legal, even though there's a myriad of ways that you can be unjust.
Okay. So he says, I've argued the law is inherently indeterminate, and further that that's not totally a bad thing for it to be indeterminate because that allows for some justice in individual cases. But he says you still may not be convinced. He says if you might be willing to admit the law is somewhat indeterminate, but you probably believe I vastly exaggerated the degree to which this is true. After all, it's obvious the law cannot be radically indeterminate. If this were the case, the law would be completely unpredictable. Judges hearing similar cases would render wildly divergent decisions. There would be no stability or uniformity in the law, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So he says the observation that the legal system is highly stable is correct, but it's a mistake to believe that this is because the law is determinate. He argues here the stability of the law derives not from any feature of the law itself, but from the overwhelming uniformity of ideological background among those empowered to make legal decisions. And then he talks about who ends up being judges, and how they pass the LSAT and they're from a certain class background. They've got an ability to engage in analytical reasoning, so on and so forth. To have been appointed to the bench, it is virtually certain that they were both politically moderate and well-connected, and until recently, white males of the correct ethnic and religious pedigree. So basically, you had uniformity in judges, and so you'd have uniformity in decisions, or some consistency in decisions. So he says, there's a high degree of agreement among judges as to how cases ought to be decided, but this agreement is due to the common set of normative presuppositions the judges share, not some immanent objective meaning that exists within the rules of law. Okay, so so what has happened, and why is it that we are unhappy with our the changes in our legal system? It's because while that is true at any moment in time, generally, over time there have been changes. So it's been a little bit gradual, but enough that it feels less and less gradual. Let's say that. But in the post-World War II era, it was a little bit gradual, I think, sort of generation by generation. He says it continually, slowly evolves in response to changing social mores and conditions, because each new generation of judges brings with it its own set of progressive normative assumptions. So, example, a generation of judges that regarded separate but equal as a perfectly legitimate interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment gave way to one which interpreted that clause as prohibiting virtually all governmental actions that classify individuals by race, which in turn gave way to one which interpreted the same language to permit benign racial classifications designed to advance the social status of minority groups. So let me just re-say that there. 3 stages, ready? Step 1, separate but equal. The law, it is okay for the law to treat people different because of their race. Step 2,
as long as
say again.
As long as it's equally applied, yes, that was the idea.
Right. Step 2, it's not okay. Don't do anything by race. Step 3, we're back to doing things by race as long as it's, to benefit minority groups. So this is the unchanging law. I mean, this isn't that long of a period of time he's talking about. This is essentially post-World War II, where you go from separate but equal to, I don't know, maybe would you have to, Ryan, go a little bit before World War II to get that separate but equal? That might be a little bit before World War II.
Separate but equal comes from basically segregation being allowed after the Civil War, kind of at the tail end of Reconstruction. I believe it'd be 1800s still, late 1800s.
Well, right. But he's saying that there was a generation of judges that regarded that as a legitimate interpretation of the 14th Amendment. And that would have been all the way up to
the Warren Court, yes.
Yeah.
Which would be the 50s.
The 50s, yeah. So all the way up through like World War II, a little bit after World War II, that was one way to look at it. and then they looked at it a different way, and then they looked at it yet a third way, all in a pretty short amount of time, really, historically speaking, right?
Right.
So he says the law is not stable, but it appears to be stable because it evolves slowly. But it does change, right? As he just
Right.
demonstrated. Um, okay. He says, over the past quarter century, the diversity movement has produced a bar and concomitantly a bench somewhat more open to people of different racial, sexual, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. And this movement has produced a judiciary that represents a broader range of ideological viewpoints than has been the case in the past. And so, over the same time period, we've seen an accelerated rate of legal change. And I think we're really feeling it in the last couple of years, right? Where we're like,
Mhm.
whoa, I never got the memo about some of these things they're pulling off now, right?
Right.
So he says, as the ideological solidarity of the judiciary breaks down, so too does the predictability of legal decision making and hence the stability of the law. So, again, it is the stability of the culturally shared values of the judiciary that gives rise to and supports the myth of the rule of law. And that's breaking down, is part of his point here. Okay, I might skip. There's a very interesting section about critical legal studies where it serves as a nice segue, but basically he talks about the critical legal studies movement since the mid 70s, very much criticized by conservative Federalist Society types, I would think, right, Ryan?
Yes.
And then he basically says, but they're right. Their case is for
Right.
the myth of the rule of law, and that's true, as he's arguing in this article. Um,
And it's not just them that are right, but they also had progenitors like the realists at the early part of the 20th century. And
mm,
then you also had even earlier figures like Oliver Wendell Holmes,
who he
uh,
quotes.
who who you and I might know as the basically as the man that gave the clear and present danger doctrine for the progressives during World War One. Basically
Mm,
laid the way for that, and if I remember correctly, ruled on it. So, um, not a great guy, but they do recognize the reality of law for what it is, and that's why they're so
right,
wildly successful every single time.
right. Right. So he says their case for the myth of the rule of law is that its purpose is to enlist the emotions of the public in support of society's political power structure. And he says that's true. When the doctrine of divine right became discredited, a replacement was needed. That replacement is the concept of the rule of law. So it's our modern divine right of kings, right?
Right? Yeah.
People
Well,
who go ahead.
if you question the rule of law, you're questioning the whole thing that just is at the foundation, mythically, of the entire system.
So right. So people who believe they live under a government of laws and not people tend to view the legal system as objective and impartial. Um, and this allows them to participate in some cruelties he talks about. Once they believe they are being commanded by an impersonal law rather than other human beings, they view their obedience to political authority as a public spirited acceptance of the requirements of social life rather than mere acquiescence to superior power. So it allows people to hide the agency of power behind a facade of words. And this has been a big emphasis in academic agents' critique of democracy, for example, which is that democracy is a way to hide, it's something you hide behind. You know, in the name of
Right.
democracy, they do all kinds of horrible things, but they're like, hey, we're just defending democracy, man. We're just defending democracy, bro. You know, right? That's why we had to bomb that country. It was for democracy. Uh, anyway, that's foreign policy. But okay. So for people who would ordinarily consider it a great evil to deprive individuals of their rights or oppress politically powerless minority groups, will respond with patriotic fervor when these same actions are described as upholding the rule of law. And this is part of the reason why, until the moment comes, the police and the military will just continue to do things that you're thinking, no, they won't do it. They won't do it. No, they'll do it. You know, um, because they're just upholding the law. You know, they're being good
Right.
citizens, right? Um, Yeah, okay. And he talks about Waco, for example. It is only when these officers have fully bought into the myth that we are a government of laws and not people, when they truly believe that their actions are commanded by some impersonal body of just rules, that they can fail to see that they are the agency used by those in power to oppress others. So the myth of impersonal government is simply the most effective means of social control available to the state. Okay, so I'm going to skip forward a bit. Okay, right. So here's where we now are going to start diverging from, say, Thomas 77's approach, I think, though I'm still learning about his perspective, so I might be wrong, but I think we would be diverging, say, from academic agents and some others on the right. So the critical legal theorists accept that the law must be provided exclusively by the state, and hence that it must impose one set of values on all members of society. Their contention is simply that the particular set of values currently being imposed is the wrong one. So they're not bothered that there is essentially monopoly law imposed by a monopoly state. They just think we need to switch it up. And I would say that in that sense, most of what I've seen in the dissident right is no different than the critical legal theorists. They just have a different idea of which set of values should be imposed by the monopoly state. All right. And he says, as long as we continue to believe that the law must be a state monopoly, there really is nothing wrong or even particularly unique about their line of argument. It's true that they want to impose democratic or socialist values on everyone through the mechanism of the law, but this does not distinguish them from anyone else. Religious fundamentalists want to impose Christian values on all via the law. Liberal Democrats want the law to ensure that everyone acts so as to realize a compassionate society. Conservative Republicans want it to ensure the realization of family values or civic virtue. Even libertarians insist that all should be governed by a law that enshrines respect for individual liberty as its preeminent value. So everybody has their content, their agenda that they want the very political law to enforce. And the critical legal theorists at least have the virtue of saying, yeah, that's what the law is. It enforces a set of values. These are the set of values we want to enforce. Right?
Right.
At least it's honest. So although only the crits may recognize it, all are engaged in a political struggle to impose their version of the good on the rest of society. But are we condemned to a continual political struggle for control of the legal system? Yes.
The universal legal system. Yeah.
Say it again.
The universal legal system. That's
Yes,
a good distinction to make at this point,
right.
because it's the nature of having that one set of law that causes this massive conflict for existence, basically, where each group needs to control it and impose their will on everyone else, because that's all there is. And if you don't do it, someone else is going to do it. Are we condemned to that?
I'm feeling really rushed, Brian. How much time do we have?
Let's wrap it up quickly.
Well, you might just have to go. I mean, we don't have to end when you go, because I don't want to mess up the ending here. This is the big finish.
In that case, I've got 12 minutes.
Okay, well, good. We'll get pretty far then. But I might do super chats after you go or something. Okay, so, are we condemned to a continual political struggle for control of the legal system? Well, yes, as long as the law remains a state monopoly, we are. There's this big, powerful engine, which is the state legal system. And you're either using it to do others or it's being done on you, right? That's kind of the deal. And so then he goes into a long thing to try to, again, sort of handhold you through this. I'm a little less concerned with my audience, talking about the idea of a situation where a country has monopoly of shoe production, and everyone is there's a provision in their constitution requiring all shoes to be the same size, and then you have different parties who are arguing for this size, larger sizes, and another political party argues for a smaller size, and then someone comes along and says, well, what if we just let shoe companies make whatever size they wanted? And everyone's like, yeah, that's crazy, man. So anyway, I'm sort of skipping over that. Read it at your leisure. But he says, what if just as they could eliminate the politics of shoe size by allowing individuals to produce and buy whatever size shoes they pleased, we could eliminate the politics of law by allowing individuals to adopt whatever rules of behavior best fit their needs. What if law is not a unique product that must be supplied on a one-size-fits-all basis by the state, but one which could be adequately supplied by the ordinary play of market forces? Now, this is going to sound like total chaos, but here's what he's got going for him, which you're going to see. History is going to weigh in on his side here, because what we assume is just the way things have to be is not the way things have always been. So, in our current setting, most people have been raised to identify law with the state. They can't conceive of the idea of legal services apart from the government, which is funny because, as he's going to point out, there's a lot of legal services that are not part of the government that most of us are familiar with. So the distinction that's important here to recognize is the distinction between order and law. Order is what we want. If we're going to live in peace and security, everybody wants that. Law is a particular method of producing order. And as it is presently constituted, law is the production of order by requiring all members of society to live under the same set of state-generated rules. That is, order is produced by centralized planning. The Supreme Court makes a decision, and 350 million Americans or whatever now are going to abide by it.
Right. Across a country basically the size of Europe, yes.
Right. A little bigger, I think. But anyway, political discourse conditions them to hear and use the terms law and order as though they were synonymous, and to express the desire for a safer, more peaceful society as a desire for law and order. But as long as the public identifies order with law, it will believe that an orderly society is impossible without the law the state provides. As long as the public believes this, it will continue to support the state almost with regard to how oppressive it may become. And that's surely the case, right? However badly people feel about the US government and the United States, for example, and there's been some pretty bad feeling in recent years.
And history, yeah.
Yeah. However badly people feel, if you say, well, maybe we just shouldn't have the US government, or, we shouldn't have a federal state at all. We should just get rid of it. Then people would say, well, then there'll be chaos. It's like, well, what do we got now?
This is particularly insane because it's worth noting twice in United States history have we had very major attempts made at having a confederal government that had no such universal law over the entire country. First with the Articles and then with the secessionist movement in the 1860s.
Yep.
But in both cases, they were crushed. And the people trying to run the Confederacy in both instances proved unable to defend it, not because of the organization of the Confederacy, but because of the lack of want to defend both, or the lack of want or the lack of means to defend both institutions.
Right. So all calls for more orderly society are interpreted as calls for more law. And since under our current political system, all law is supplied by the state, all calls for more orderly society are calls for a more active and powerful state. Which seems crazy, right? Because, again, it's the doublethink. We've also been taught that the worst thing in the world is to have a totalitarian state.
Mm-hmm.
And that's terrible, right? But the logic, he's pointing out, of the law and order mentality is to push us towards a totalitarian state. Only with ultimate power of the state to enforce the law can we really have order in society. That's sort of where this leads us. While at the same time, goodness, we wouldn't want to have a totalitarian state. That'd be undemocratic, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah. Okay, so he talks about Orwellian newspeak. It's the process by which words are redefined to render certain thoughts unthinkable. And so he says that's what's happened with this law and order thing, tying that all up together. It's made it so that because it's, a common want from all that we have order in society, and that's been tied up in our thinking with the law provided by the state, we can't even imagine the idea of a non-state generated order. That's just off the table, right? Okay, so he's going to propose it, of course. I'm sure you saw that coming. So he's going to say, let's consider a free market in legal services. And he quotes Sherlock Holmes talking to the good doctor, "You see, Watson, but you do not observe, because examples of non-state law are all around us." Let's go through a few examples. Labor management collective bargaining agreements. Won't go into great detail there. Homeowner agreements, which create both the rules, and this is key, dispute settlement procedures within a condominium or housing development. Universities have codes of conduct for students and faculty. Again, it includes elaborate judicial procedures to deal with violation of the codes of conduct, violations. Typically, they have their own campus police forces.
Right.
And then this one should be really familiar to people who have signed anything lately. Binding arbitration or mediation. I know that I personally have signed many things that say if there's a disagreement between us, you agree to an arbitration procedure, as opposed to going to the courts, right? And so there's this whole set of things called alternative dispute resolution, ADR, and it's huge. It's a huge business, by the way. I've seen some figures on it. The whole mediation as a business is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's actually a quite thriving, active market. He says also, though, so that's what's around us, but also we can look to the past. There's the situation of African American communities in the segregated South, or the immigrant communities in New York in the first quarter of the 20th century. For various reasons, they ended up effectively cut off from the state legal system. So they didn't disintegrate into chaotic disorder. They were able to privately supply themselves with the rules of behavior and dispute settlement procedures necessary to maintain peaceful, stable, and highly structured communities. And the friend I've made, the black Muslim friend I've made, who's an expert on historic black communities, has been telling me exactly about this.
And
In the South, small black communities in the South that officially were under the rule of the white mayor or whatever, but actually de facto had their own leadership and their own structures for maintaining order and so forth within the community.
And not to be too vain here, but someone else in our spheres has proposed a system of organization and governance very similar to what we're describing here.
Yes, I wanted to highlight this. This is Ryan's most recent video, just a little over a week ago, Strategy for the Right, the Confederacy. And I'm going to drop that link into the live chat right now. I said Ryan's article, Ryan's video. Anyway, it comes from it's very similar to what you delivered at the US event in February, where you were arguing for the same thing, saying that, maybe this will work better if we don't try to all be one thing. And that's in part what you were getting at, right?
Right, that's one of the things. And the other things being we can resolve our own disputes. We don't have to keep getting into like a slapping fight every single time someone disagrees with another person.
Right.
So in a way, make our own rules of conduct and our own treaties or resolutions for how we communicate.
Okay, do you want to gracefully exit now that we've showed your video? Because you pretty much need to go, and I don't want to mess you up. What?
Well, I feel bad doing that because it feels like I just shilled and left. But
no, that's the way to go.
Yeah, and hit them with the medieval anarchism. This will tie in very nicely to what.
It's coming. Yeah.
All right. Well, have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay. Let's see. It looks like it's just going to leave a still image on there for some reason. Why is that? Okay, let me fix that real quick. I'll just hide it. Okay, there we go. All right, so let's continue, finish up the article. We're actually pretty close. Another example is commercial law. Our commercial law arose almost entirely from the law merchant, a non-governmental set of rules and procedures developed by merchants to quickly and peacefully resolve disputes and facilitate commercial relations. This is particularly important in international trade, right? You want to do business, but what do you do when your jurisdiction is unclear and all that, right? Furthermore, and I think we have a super chat that references this, property, tort, and criminal law are all the products of common law processes by which rules of behavior evolve out of and are informed by the particular circumstances of actual human controversies. So there's a great common law tradition coming from England in particular. And he says, in fact, a careful study of Anglo-American legal history will demonstrate that almost all of the law which facilitates peaceful human interaction arose in this way, whereas on the other hand, he argues, the law actually made by the state, there's that law versus legislation distinction that Hayek pointed to in particular. The law actually made by the state is precisely the law that does not work. It doesn't work in the sense of facilitating peaceful interaction and instead generates conflict, right? Okay. And then he just says, as usual with this sort of thing, let's not be too static in our thinking. If we had a free market in legal services, would it just be like what we have today with a corporate logo on it? And he says, no, the free market wouldn't necessarily provide these things in their current form. And so in what way might it trend away from that? He says, first of all, it'd be safe to assume there would not be any universally binding society-wide set of legal rules. In a free market, the law would not come in a one-size-fits-all. Certain rules would be very common. Prohibitions against murder, assault, and theft would, C.S. Lewis wrote about that in The Abolition of Man when he talked about the Tao and the great appendix to The Abolition of Man, where he draws on law codes through the ages and across the world and across history to show that certain aspects of law are common across human societies. The application of those rules, how to resolve disputes, how to determine guilt, what to do when someone's guilty, all of these things are going to have wide variance across cultures and so forth, right? Even if every culture in the world forever agrees that murder is wrong, how that actually works out in detail, there's going to be quite a bit of variation. He says that he doesn't think there would be anything resembling a uniform body of contract law. For example, think about the difference between commercial contracts and consumer contracts. Commercial contracts are between corporate entities. There's specialized knowledge of industrial practices. There's a financial interest in minimizing the interruption of business. You want to kind of, even if you're, arguing, you want to you need to keep making money, right? So you need to keep working together in other areas, maybe even if you're arguing about some particular contract. I see this in my own work. So in disputes over consumer contracts, the parties might be satisfied with the current system of litigation in which the parties present their cases to an impartial judge or jury who renders a verdict for one side or the other. But in commercial disputes, they're probably going to prefer a mediation process. And in fact, in practice, that's what they do now. With a negotiated settlement in order to preserve an ongoing commercial relationship. That means you don't really want to have a full falling out, even if you can't agree on some particular deal together. You want to keep going with the other ways in which you're working together. So you want a quick and informal arbitration in order to avoid the losses associated with excessive delay. So they would want mediators, arbitrators, or judges who are highly knowledgeable about commercial practice. They don't want to end up in front of a jury of random people, right? When you've got some detailed dispute about chemical manufacturing or something like that, right? An individual might settle his or her disputes with neighbors according to voluntarily adopted homeowner association rules and procedures, on the one hand. And then with coworkers, it might be according to the rules and procedures described in the collective bargaining agreement. Whereas with members of his or her religious congregation, according to scriptural law or a tribunal within the church or something, right? The New Testament, in fact, essentially says you should not bring other Christians to secular courts. I don't know how many Christians pay attention to that, but it's in there. In other words, the church should deal with disputes within itself. And of course, so you have the whole tradition of canon law. And then that same individual, if he has a conflict with other drivers, that might be dealt with according to processes agreed to in an automobile insurance contract. In fact, that's pretty much how things go a lot of the time now, right? It's really, you exchange insurance information, and the police makes a report. The policeman makes a report, but that's sort of a formality. You don't really, the police and the state court system is not generally who you're dealing with an automobile accident, right? And then with total strangers, you might select a dispute resolution company from the yellow pages of the phone book. So therefore, the rules and the arbitration procedures, the dispute settlement procedure might be widely varying, and you yourself might deal with all of these in different spheres of your life. That is what it looks like to have different rules and different laws, so to speak, going on. It's not as crazy as it sounds. It's actually around us all the time. He also argues that with the emphasis on, racial and sexual identity and so forth, many disputes among members of the same minority group or among women would be brought to niche dispute resolution companies composed predominantly of members of the relevant group. Maybe women say, hey, we don't want to be judged by men. We want to have our courts, our arbitration, female arbitration system or something like that. So what would this look like? Well, here we go right to why this channel is doing this article, right? I suspect that in many ways, a free market in law would resemble the situation in medieval Europe before the rise of strong central governments in which disputants could select among several fora. So the parties could bring their case in either village, shire, urban, merchant, manorial, ecclesiastical, or royal courts. You could actually kind of like pick in it to some degree where you would bring your case, right? The local lord is totally corrupt. Let's see if the church will help us, resolve this dispute, because none of us trust the Lord or whatever, or vice versa, right? So open your mind. This is not crazy what he's talking about. It's return, right? It's return to a European tradition, the way of our people, for hundreds and hundreds of years, was to have overlapping, competing legal systems. Not a single law handed down from on high. There was not a Supreme Court of the Middle Ages, right? So furthermore, he says we might see a different approach to all of this. The current state-supplied legal system is adversarial in nature, pitting the plaintiff or prosecution against the defendant in a winner-take-all, loser-get-nothing contest. And the reason for this is historically quite interesting. It has nothing to do with that being an effective way of settling disputes. It has everything to do with medieval English kings' desire to centralize power. The crown was able to extend its temporal power relative to the feudal lords, as well as raise significant revenue by commanding or enticing the parties to local disputes to bring their case before the king or other royal official for decision. So the way we do things now goes back to that, as opposed to the earlier medieval tradition. Our current system of adversarial presentation to a third-party decision maker is an outgrowth of these early public choice considerations, not because it was a better way to do things. And he has a footnote that intrigues me, where he in particular mentions a book called Law and Revolution by Harold Berman, which I'm tempted to try to read and cover on the show. So our current system, its adversarial nature causes each party to view the other as an enemy to be defeated, and its winner-take-all character motivates each to fight as hard as he or she can to the bitter end. Since the loser gets nothing, he or she has every reason to attempt to reopen the dispute, which gives rise to frequent appeals. He thinks that under free market conditions, people would not want that. They would adopt a compositional rather than confrontational dispute settlement procedure. That is, procedures designed to compose disputes and reconcile the parties rather than render third-party judgments. This was the essential character of the ancient legal system that was replaced by royal jurisdiction being extended. Before the rise of the European nation states, medieval anarchism, as I've been calling it, before the rise of the European nation states, what we might anachronistically call judicial procedure was chiefly a set of complex negotiations between the parties mediated by the members of the local community in an effort to reestablish a harmonious relationship. So public pressure was brought on the parties to settle their dispute peacefully through negotiation and compromise. And so the incentives of this ancient system favored cooperation and conciliation rather than defeating one's opponent. So he thinks a free market in law would resemble the ancient system a great deal more than the modern one. So this isn't that speculative. It's all around us with arbitration and alternative dispute systems that, as you may know, if you've signed contracts recently, is all over the place now. It's a huge part of the legal landscape at this point. Also, it's a traditional way for Europeans to do things. It's actually a return to how Europe worked when it was rising in the Middle Ages and having that early industrial revolution we've covered in the show 1,000 years ago and so forth. So Europe was built on this sort of more anarchistic legal system, right? So recent experiments with negotiated dispute settlement have demonstrated that mediation produces a higher level of participant satisfaction with regard to both process and result. It resolves cases more quickly and at significantly lower cost, and it results in a higher rate of voluntary compliance with the final decree than is the case with traditional litigation. And this is unsurprising given that mediation's lack of a winner-take-all format encourages the parties to seek common ground rather than attempt to vanquish the opponent. Let's see, and then here's his wrap-up. I'll just read out the last from his sort of conclusion. I hope you're finding this interesting and mind-bending and challenging, and I will get to the super chats. I can see people are intrigued and arguing and stuff. So, belief in the existence, this is concluding remarks here. Belief in the existence of an objective, non-ideological law enables average citizens to see those advocating legal positions inconsistent with their values as inappropriately manipulating the law for political purposes, while viewing their own position as neutrally capturing the plain meaning immanent within the law. The citizens' faith in the rule of law allows them to hide from themselves both that their position is as politically motivated as is their opponents', and that they are attempting to impose their values on their opponents as much as their opponents are attempting to impose their values on them. With the acceptance of the myth of the rule of law comes a blindness to the fact that laws are merely the commands of those with political power. And there's an increased willingness to submit yourself to the yoke of the state. But there is no such thing as a government of law and not people. It's a law the law is an amalgam of contradictory rules and counter rules expressed in inherently vague language that can yield a legitimate legal argument for any desired conclusion. So for this reason, as long as the law remains a state monopoly, it will always reflect the political ideology of those invested with decision-making power. They are going to decide the exception, to use Carl Schmitt's term. Like it or not, we are faced with only two choices. We can continue the ideological power struggle for control of the law, in which the group that gains dominance is empowered to impose its will on the rest of the society, or we can end the monopoly and, I would add, return to the way Europe did things when it was rising. No clearer example of this exists. So finally, he says no clearer example of the way that law is political exists than the legal process by which our Constitution was transformed from a document creating a government of limited powers and guaranteed rights into one which provides the justification for the activities of the all-encompassing superstate of today. So conservatives and libertarians at least see this, and we just need to accept that that is what's going to happen with law. It's the nature of the beast. So he says, the time has come for those committed to individual liberty to realize that the establishment of a truly free society requires the abandonment of the myth of the rule of law. Okay, I'm going to go off that screen And I'm going to pull up some chats here. Let's see. Anything on Subscribestar? Nope. Okay, let me make sure I get all my super chats on YouTube. All right, here we go. Good stuff. Mickey says, it might interest you that in continental tradition, we do not use rule of law, but legal state or state of law. So in German, that's the Rechtsstaat. And yeah, I would say that, I don't know. I don't know the linguistic tradition there because I don't speak one of the continental languages, but I'm kind of inclined to think that that's even more straightforward than saying rule of law. Literally, it's just, the legal state, the law and the state combined together, right? Chris Primer has an interesting pointer. He says, check out the Eurodollar University podcast episode 221, The Myth of Paul Volcker and the Powerful Fed. I think you'll find it fascinating. Yes, that would be interesting. Paul Volcker is given credit for ending the Carter Depression as chair of the Federal Reserve and bringing in a relatively a boom time under the later part of the Reagan administration. So that would be quite interesting to see someone undermine that. Cringewalker says, this is reminding me a lot of why Satan is described as a prosecuting lawyer. That's right. In the scriptures, it talks about two legal analogies here, right? One is that Satan is the accuser. I think that's what Satan means, what the name means. He's the accuser, that like in a court, someone who's accusing you in court. But then it also refers to Jesus as our advocate, right? Again, like a picture of a court, someone is advocating for you against your accuser. Mickey says, this would take more than I can easily super chat, but there's a cultural difference between finding law and making law. This article assumes the latter. Well, as you can see, it didn't, because he brought in the common law, which is more that notion of finding law. And so that finding law versus making law would be what Hayek calls the law versus legislation distinction. And I'd recommend these. It's 3 volumes, which makes it sound like it's huge, but each of them are short. Law, Legislation, and Liberty, in 3 volumes by Hayek. Great books. The volume 2 talks about the mirage of social justice. So he's going back after social justice a long, long time ago, before there were such things as SJWs. He wrote a whole book attacking the notion of social justice. It's very persuasive. And he introduced to me that distinction of law versus legislation. You can also see this in Bruno Leoni's book, which Hayek was influenced by, I think, in his own books. So yeah, I think what we see here, Mickey, with the law versus legislation distinction is that the made law, the legislation, is particularly arbitrary. The found law is better, but I think even so, Hanses is arguing here that we don't need to be under one, found law system that for everything, right? Even there ought to be decentralization and diversity. So there's a found law for homeowner associations, right? We different homeowner associations try different things, and they're trying to find something that's going to give you a harmonious neighborhood, and you're going to learn from each other. And homeowner associations are going to sort of find their way towards rules that work well for homeowner associations, and so on and so forth, right? But the laws of a homeowner association are not going to be the same. The rules of the found laws of a homeowner association are not going to be the same as those for a church or something like that, right? Okay, and then one more super chat came in, still on the screen. Did I miss anybody else? I don't think so. Let me just make sure, and I'll hit that last super chat. Yeah, that was Mickey's. Okay, then Enlightened Despot says, hidden power structures govern these consensual systems like arbitration, mediation, etc. It's not utopia. You see this in Japan, where power is wielded implicitly and inferentially, female type. Yeah, right. No, I mean, okay, so this is where you're right, Enlightened Despot. It's not utopia. The point, as always, with the what I think of as the anarchistic insight is that getting away from monopoly puts you in a better position than dealing with monopoly. So whether it's the monopoly, getting away from the monopoly state, getting away from the monopoly legal system, it doesn't mean that now you're in heaven, right? We don't get heaven on earth, but it means it's better than the alternative. And why is that? It's because competing systems are a check on each other. And if you look at the not that long ago episode on medieval anarchism, we go into that in great length, talking about how in the Middle Ages you had lots of small politically substantive units, that had real authority within their sphere, and the result of that is that liberty did better with all of these smaller polities competing with each other. So similarly, we don't have to say that this certain kind of arbitration system is going to be the best thing ever. We could just say though that, like in the Middle Ages, we would have a choice. We could go to maybe multiple arbitration providers, or we could say that arbitration method is not the way to go with this sort of thing, and we want to go to mediators, et cetera, et cetera. The point is to have choices, and those choices act as a check, right? With competing legal systems, legal services, then if one is terrible, they lose customers, right? Like everybody's like, wow, whenever anybody uses that that dispute resolution system, whatever it is, it just ends up in everybody unhappy, like disputes don't get resolved, they just get worsened. Well, then people just stop going to it. And so competition starts to weed out the inferior dispute resolution systems in favor of better ones. So I think that's everything. Thank you guys. Great engagement today. And I think I've shared everything. The video description has the link to the John Hasnas article in audio form by our friend Skeptical Waves. It has the the short article by Thomas 777, which I really recommend to you. It's a very, the Hasnas article is 1995. Thomas just wrote this article in the last week or two, recently, and really updating it and talking about the changing legal landscape because of COVID measures, which he's calling, that we're now living in long COVID, right? The ongoing consequences of COVID. And then this whole idea of, not having one system and having different systems. You can see this in Ryan's article, Ryan Turnipseed's article, which I shared in the live chat. Oh, I'm sorry, video. His video, consuming very different media. I'll share it one more time, in fact. His article called Strategy for the Right, the Confederacy, which echoes what he gave, excellent talk he gave at our event outside Nashville in February, where he's recommending that a way to do a movement can be to, rather than try to have us all be under one, big boss or something, to be decentralized. So a decentralized approach even to, political movements, you could say. Okay, well, hopefully, I think I'm not even going to try. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff in the chat and great conversation going on there. Obviously, this raises a lot of questions, but I want to point out, I was saying this to Ryan, I want to share it with you all. I said I'm liking the medieval anarchist angle more and more because as we see in the Hasnas article that we went over, number one, the Middle Ages really were anarchistic by our standards. Maybe they weren't, perfect anarchy or whatever. They, by our standards, it was anarchy compared to what we're dealing with now. Two, it was a way of doing things that really happened. So we're not talking about utopian imagineering. Our European ancestors did things this way, right? And then third, it was the way we Europeans did things for a long time. So it's actually a tradition of our people. So from a traditionalist point of view, from a historical point of view, from the point of view of, what do you call it, political philosophy and economics and so forth, um, it all points back to a different way of doing things than what we've been suffering under the modern nation state, which is failing before our eyes, I think. So I think we need to do two things. We need to open our mind to these possibilities, which I've tried to do with this. And number two, we need to go ahead and engage in these different approaches, because I think the nation state will fall. I don't know when. Could be 100 years from now. Could be tomorrow. I think it will fall. And the sooner that we are positioning ourselves to function without it, to function without that monopoly legal system, and to be able to get along with each other and have social peace without, well, what frankly has brought a lot of chaos, the state legal system. The sooner we position ourselves for that, the easier it will be to handle the new era that seems to be coming. Okay, so thank you, everyone. And we will be back with you next week with, it looks like we will have Black Horse for an update on some of the very interesting things going on in the market. Some pretty bad things, frankly, but we'll cover it one way or another. And thanks everyone for being part of the show today. Great show.